Hi, it's me, the storyteller. Thank you for joining me. Most of my stories on this channel are based on actual events, and some aren't. I'll let you decide if this story is fiction, or if it's not. In 2017, an 18-year-old college student, Drake Marin, was attending his first semester at a local community college in the quaint city of Eugene, Oregon. He and his mother Tanya were getting acclimated to their new home and the routines of living in a new environment. What awaited them was a series of chilling events that straddled the line between haunting nightmares and reality itself. Drake's father passed away in active military duty when he was only 3, and with being an only child, he and his mother had a very close relationship. After losing her husband, Tanya focused on her career so she could raise Drake and give him the best life she thought possible. A couple of weeks after moving into their new place, Drake began having nightmares. He believed the bad dreams were just a byproduct of moving to a new area of town, or the change from high school to college and the stress it can cause. He felt it would eventually pass in time, so he kept it to himself, not to worry his mother. As days passed, Drake's nightmares became more vivid and interactive. He would awake in a cold sweat, laying in odd positions on his bed, and sometimes standing up in his room, his closet, or even the hallway. But what he noticed most about his nightmares was a reoccurring but disturbing figure that appeared in every dream. A man donning a burlap sack over his head, with small holes cut out for the eyes. He wore a clad, ill-fitted dark suit and seemed to only appear from a distance, watching and observing him. The man would loom at Drake's school, at the mall, or at the movies with friends, but could only be seen by Drake. With every dream, the next one revealed the burlap man even closer than before, causing the nightmares to become more intense and scarier than the previous one. One particular night, Tanya was working late, so Drake made some Hot Pockets, turned on some music, and decided to research bad dreams on his laptop, and discovered some alarming consistencies. He found many people experienced night terrors after moving into older homes located in areas with a deep-rooted history. Their home was built in the 1970s, but had been completely remodeled. Plus, it was in a gentrified area, so everything felt fresh and new. Drake ran his hands down his face and sat back on his bed, thinking he was probably wasting his time. Just then, there was a loud knock at the front door. Startled, Drake sat up and moved down the hallway to the top of the stairs. He wasn't expecting anyone, plus it was after 9 p.m. He waited. The knock came again. The front door was flanked by 2 thin windows, so he tried to position himself to see if he could make out the person standing on the other side. Whoever it was must have been standing very close to the door. A third knock came. Drake moved apprehensively down the stairs and crept up to the door. He called out,
Who is it?
but there was no response. He hesitantly leaned toward the peephole and looked through it, but he couldn't see anyone. In fact, it was dark, as if whoever it was covered the peephole with their finger. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. He shook it off and took a deep breath. Then he turned on the porch light and looked through the peephole again. It was clear. He could see the porch and further out into the street, but no one was there. What he did next was probably ill-advised in retrospect. He slowly unlocked and opened the door, then stepped cautiously onto the porch. It was quiet, with no trace of anyone. He thought it may have been just a couple of kids messing around, so he went back inside and mindfully locked the door. He assumed he'd allowed himself to get a little worked up, considering his recent dreams and what he had just researched on the internet. Drake's mother returned home about an hour later, so he decided to tell her what had happened at the front door. Tanya, a bit troubled, suggested they get one of those doorbell cameras, so she immediately hopped on Amazon and ordered one. She noticed Drake's tired eyes and asked him if he'd been sleeping well. Drake considered telling her about his dreams, but instead, he made something up like he'd been gaming late at night. She accepted the answer with a little disappointment, then kissed him on the forehead suggesting he go to bed and get some rest. As Drake walked away, Tanya watched him with concerned eyes. The next day, Drake woke up a little later than he'd liked, but he felt refreshed. He hadn't had any dreams that night, which put him in good spirits. His class at the community college started in 25 minutes, so he rushed out of the house without breakfast. It was cloudy with a light drizzle when he arrived at school, a typical day in Oregon during the winter. When Drake made it to his class, he noticed the lecture had already started, so he made his way up the set of stairs to find a seat. As he moved to an open spot, he felt all eyes in the room were on him, including his professor. He sat down in the back row of the lecture hall and watched everyone turn back to the front slowly and in unison. This seemed odd to him. He pulled his laptop from his backpack, sat it in front of him, and opened it up. The screen lit up with a video image. It was from the very room he was sitting in, but from the point of view behind Drake, looking over his shoulder. Then the image began to zoom into where he was sitting. He swiveled in his chair to look at the wall behind him, but he couldn't see a camera mounted anywhere. He turned back to his laptop and tried closing out the window, but the image remained. He tried rebooting, but the computer wasn't responding. He noticed the image was definitely focused on him, but then the camera image started to tilt upward, revealing his professor lecturing the class. That's when he realized it wasn't his professor. It was the burlap man. Drake shot his head up, and to his horror, the burlap man was looking straight toward him. The entire class turned around to stare at him, just like before. There was a long pause. Then, the burlap man began to walk slowly up the steps toward Drake. Drake stood quickly, knocking his laptop to the ground, simultaneously jolting awake in his bed. Heart pounding, shirt drenched in sweat. Drake had indeed been dreaming. After getting dressed, he met his mother downstairs, who had prepared his breakfast. But Drake wasn't hungry. He sat at the kitchen bar, playing with his food and scrolling on his phone, trying to understand what was going on with him, and if this moment was his reality or just another dream. Tanya snapped her fingers, waking him from his daze. Knowing something wasn't quite right with her son, Tanya cornered Drake with questions until he finally broke down and told her about his nightmares. This caused her a little grief, but reassured him it was probably all of the changes going on. She told him she would pick him up something from the pharmacy to help him sleep before she shuffled out of the house. Drake sighed, pushed his food away, and left for class. The day went by a little slower than usual. Drake couldn't focus in his classes and was becoming more paranoid. As he walked across campus, he caught glimpses of the burlap man, stepping behind a tree, disappearing in the crowd, and on the drive home, crossing the street in front of him at a stoplight. His fear was rising, and when he arrived home, he quickly locked the front door and peered out of the window through the shutters. A voice came from behind him. "What are you looking at?" Drake jumped in response and whipped his head around to see it was his mother. He said it was nothing and was getting ready to head upstairs when Tanya stopped him to show him the new doorbell camera. She shared the mobile app and took him through signing in so he could see the live image. He couldn't deny the image looked a little creepy, but it put him at ease knowing he could see anyone that came to the door. Later that night, after dinner, Tanya stopped by Drake's room to give him some melatonin she purchased from the drugstore earlier that day. She explained it would help him have a better night's sleep. Drake got ready for bed and was brushing his teeth in his bathroom. He leaned over to spit in the sink, and when he rose up, the burlap man was in the reflection of the mirror behind him. He turned around to face the man, but he was gone. He turned back, and he had also disappeared from the mirror. Again, he contemplated whether this was real or he was asleep. He had an idea. He dug in his sink cabinet and found a safety pin. He opened it up and poked the palm of his hand. He recoiled, feeling the pain. He believed he was awake. After retreating to his bedroom, he took the melatonin his mother had left him, shut off his light, and got into bed. Drake stared at the ceiling for what seemed like half an hour, until his eyes got heavy and finally slipped into a deep sleep. Sometime during the night, a sound of a heartbeat filled Drake's room. He felt cold. Had his mother changed the thermostat? No. His bed comforter had fallen on the floor, along with his sheets. Something felt strange. He realized he couldn't move. He felt constricted, pressed against his mattress. His eyes were heavy, but he was able to force them open a little wider. Fear engulfed his heart by what he saw. The burlap man was in Drake's room, standing over him at the foot of his bed, lit only by a sliver of light. Drake tried to break free of the paralysis, but it was no use. He felt the burlap man in control. Was it some kind of spell? He watched as the burlap man reached into his jacket pocket and pulled something out. It was a small cardboard tag with a rubber band, like the ones used in a morgue to identify the deceased. The burlap man bent down and attached the tag to one of Drake's toes. Drake tried to scream, but his mouth was sealed. All he could do was breathe, and that was becoming more difficult. Suddenly, Drake felt the pressure release from his body against the mattress, but the constriction remained. His rigid body began to rise, levitating toward the ceiling. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed the burlap man doing something else. He was meticulously implanting large spikes in the mattress, with the sharp ends pointing upward. This process took what seemed like an hour. With no warning, Drake began to lower toward his now spike-filled bed. He felt powerless. He couldn't move or scream. Then his body dropped hard and fast into the spikes. Darkness. Morning came, and as Tanya brushed her teeth, she absent-mindedly scrolled through her phone notifications and stumbled upon a video alert from her doorbell camera, time-stamped at 3:48 a.m. Curiously, but with a hesitant finger, she pressed play. The screen flickered to life to reveal their front door and porch area. 2 seconds passed, and a shadowy figure wearing a burlap sack on their head emerged from their home. Tanya stood frozen as she watched the figure step onto the porch and walk a straight line toward the street. As soon as the figure passed the streetlight, there was a flicker in the image, and the person was gone. Tanya gasped and thought of Drake. She rushed out of her room and down the hall. When she reached Drake's room, she burst in. Drake was gone. Had he left early? That would have been uncharacteristic, so she glanced out of the window and noticed his car was still parked in the driveway. She walked to the end of the hallway near the stairs and called out for him. Silence. She walked back to his bedroom and just stood with her arms crossed, confused, her mind racing with the most disturbing possibilities. That's when she noticed something she didn't initially see. A deep imprint of Drake's body pressed into the bedsheets. Tanya stepped closer to inspect it. It appeared as if Drake had simply vanished. The room, which should have held signs of life, echoed with an unsettling silence. The air thickened with fear, and a disturbing sense of loss filled Tanya's heart. In that crushing moment, she felt an overwhelming darkness engulf her soul, her instincts reeling of the thought of her son's absence. As the situation spiraled out of control, Tanya found herself consumed by terror, panic tightening its grip around her chest. Suddenly, she was pulled from the abyss of her fears, awakening in a jolt, gasping for air. As she looked around her own bedroom, the totality of the scene settled upon her. What had transpired was merely a nightmare. She threw her covers off of her, jumped out of bed, and shuffled down the hall to Drake's room. She opened the door, and with a sigh of relief, Drake was sleeping safely in his bed, nestled within the waking realm of normalcy, free from the shadows that had haunted her. Tanya slowly and quietly sat on the edge of Drake's bed. She closed her eyes, pondering her dream. As she recollected more details of the nightmare, it was becoming clear. Her memory flashed from that fateful night Drake heard the knock at the door, to seeing the burlap man in his classroom, to installing the doorbell camera. Wait, she hadn't purchased that camera. None of what transpired over the last few weeks was real. This was her vivid nightmare. A long, tortuous bad dream, not Drake's. In the following weeks, Tanya and Drake began attending a local church where they both were able to get some much-needed counseling. Tanya discovered she was still harboring the loss of her husband and learning to understand her new role as a single mother. Her deep-seated love for Drake and the combined fear of losing him resulted in her carrying a weight of anxiety she could not bear alone. Although the grief has never fully gone away, Tanya's nightmares have, as both her and her son Drake are healing with every passing day. This surreal narrative ultimately beckons us to question the nature of our nightmares. Are they mere remnants of a restless mind, or could they be windows into a deeper truth, waiting for us to decipher? If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to the channel. Give it a like, a comment, and maybe a share. But if you didn't like the story, maybe share it with someone you don't like. In any case, I'm glad you stuck around to the end.